Okay, welcome everybody to the first session of the conference. A little bit of housekeeping. There's going to be 3 presentations for this session. Each one is going to be 20 minutes long with 5 minutes for questions at the end of each. So if you could hold your questions till the end. And then there's going to be a 5-minute period before the next presenter begins. So if you want to travel to another session, that's your time. So up first, we have Meredith Stoll and her presentation of how to implement a stormwater GIS program from scratch. Meredith is a GIS analyst at the Durham County Stormwater Division. She holds a Master's of Geospatial Information Science and Technology from NC State. Meredith has experience in private consulting, local government, and GIS education. In her free time, she loves to travel and explore the Triangle with her husband and her husky. So it's all yours.
Great, thank you, Andy, for the introduction. All right, hey guys, my name is Meredith Stoll, and I am the GIS analyst in the Stormwater Division at Durham County. I've worked at Durham County for a little over 2 years now. Today I'm going to talk about how to implement a successful GIS program from scratch. Today I'm going to talk a lot about stormwater because that's my specialty now, but my hope is that the strategies that I talk about today can be applied to other categories of government or even outside the government context. Okay. All right, as GIS professionals, we're often in the position where we're working on a project that maybe was someone else's idea, or maybe the data that we need was created by someone else. Or you're coming into a job where they've been doing the same thing the same way for the past 20 years. So I know we've all been there. And if you're like me, you've probably thought to yourself, well, if I was in charge or if I did this myself, things would be so much better. When I was first hired by Durham in 2020, I had the opportunity to start everything from scratch. And when I say everything, I mean everything. And so being a type A person, that is really the dream. But then when I really started to get into it and get things started, I really started to feel the intimidation. Okay. So when I first started working at Durham, I was still relatively early on in my career. I did what any tech-savvy person would do, and I went to Google. And I knew I had some experience with stormwater, but not a lot. And I was pretty disappointed and surprised when I went to Google and I couldn't find a lot about stormwater data management or stormwater specific best practices. I found a few things, but I really struggled to find something that was relevant to my position. But that ends now. We're going to talk about it and we're going to share everything that we've learned about that. So a little bit about Durham County. Durham County Stormwater is combined with our Erosion Control Division, so we can work hand in hand to provide a seamless process for our developers and engineers that we work with. We issue stormwater permits and land disturbance permits for new development in the county. Our jurisdiction does vary per project. For stormwater, we're only concerned with outside of city limits, but for erosion control, we have jurisdiction inside and outside. We enforce DEQ environmental regulations, which vary per watershed. We have a stormwater utility fee that we assess based on impervious areas per property. This is where we get the majority of our funding. We perform stream determinations and handle illicit discharges. We address complaints from residents and landowners, and I could really go on and on. But with all of the development going on in Durham right now, you could understand that we are very busy. So out of respect for our ratepayers, we always try to tie everything back to our guiding principles. These are efficiency, compliance, resiliency, and environmental justice. I can touch on this again in a minute, and I will, but whenever we're in the planning phase of a project, we always try to tie everything back to our guiding principles. And this also helps us stay organized. So I just want to touch on that. Sometimes the hardest part is just figuring out where to get started. I found that starting with data management was really a good place to start. So the goal for us, the goal of our data management system was to manage every departmental activity, all of our tasks in the same system. We also wanted a geo visualization component, and we wanted to make sure that we could build upon it and as we took on more projects and as we grew as a department. So starting off, when I started working at Durham County in 2020, every project had a paper file that was stored in a file cabinet. All payments for fees were made in person at our downtown Durham office. Site inspections were completed on paper forms. Numerous spreadsheets were used to keep track of information. And we did have a SQL database that was used for some project purposes. In March of 2020, City of Durham and Durham County systems were hit with a malware attack. And then shortly after that, when COVID hit, everyone was sent home. And we really had to figure out how to get everything digital almost immediately due to both of those factors. So for our data management system, I created a database in Survey123. In the back end, I created an SDE database with feature classes, tables, and relationship classes. These were published to our portal as feature services. Power Automate is used to create webhooks to connect Survey123 to Outlook and our file management system. On the front end, Survey123 is used to add and view data. Feature reports are used to replace all of the paper forms and permit placards. We have a web application that visualizes and filters data, a dashboard that shows metrics for reporting, an experience builder app that ties all of that together. So what we like about Survey123 is that it is that the users are interacting with this robust database, but they actually don't even realize it. They just like how it looks in the forms. All right. So data standards are particularly important with government data, so it's important to think about this from the beginning. When starting a program from the beginning, I wanted to make sure that all of the data we're setting up was clean and consistent. We are not interested in creating problems for our future selves. So for this, I mostly just collaborated within my department. I ran everything by them and had them approve, and we discussed all data schemas. I studied some public data sets that are maintained by other similar local governments, and also used FGDC standards. They highly recommend that you use their standards for government data. But I basically took what was relevant from all of these sources, collaborated with my own department, and we went from there. So now that we have a data management system and we've got data standards, it was time to revisit the goals of our department. So it's beneficial to outline short-term and long-term goals at the same time. In the short term, we wanted to create a data management system and data standards. So check, we've done that. Long-term, we need to focus on compliance. So there are standards that come from the state level that we are required to meet within a certain time frame. This on the screen is an example. We have to create a certain data set within the next 5 years. And so we need to start taking steps now to make sure that we can be in compliance with those when the time comes. Long-term, we're also trying to develop data sets and collection for all of our stormwater assets and infrastructure, erosion control projects and stormwater projects, and then also tracking all of the necessary metrics for state reporting. We also want to automate these workflows as much as possible to make everything more efficient. So another component when you're starting a GIS program from scratch is to pay attention to new legislation from local, state, and federal levels. I will be the first to admit that I'm not good at this. And if you're not good at it either, that's okay. There are people out there who are really good at it. So become friends with them. Or, or you could join a professional group that regularly reports on this. There are listservs out there. So if you're like me, there are other options out there. So learn about the standards that your department is required to meet when this new legislation comes out. See if federal initiatives are funneling funds down to state and local governments. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is here on the screen, is a good example of this. Make the case for GIS and advocate for those funds. The American Rescue Plan Act is another example and another great source of GIS funds. Other than branches of government, DEQ and other state agencies will set standards for local jurisdictions. So that can also directly impact your GIS program. So speaking of funding, budget limitations will always be a factor. So sometimes it's hard to budget for everything you need when budget season comes along. And sometimes it's hard to convince people to fund GIS projects. And so all that to say is you can always be on the lookout for external sources of funding. For us, we have a utility fee, which is definitely helpful. That is separate from our county tax budget. But when we implemented the fee in 2020, we actually implemented it at a reduced rate because we didn't want to add an additional burden to our citizens during COVID. So as a result of that, we were working on a reduced budget. So because of this, we took advantage of external funding in the form of grants. We received a few grants from the Environmental Enhancement Grant Program, which is from the North Carolina Department of Justice, and we also received some ARPA funds as well. So always be on the lookout for these, and also maybe consider partnering with a nonprofit or a university, but I will also expand on that in a minute. So in addition to software, hardware is another consideration when you're building a program from scratch. The first step is to ask around and see what equipment is available to you, if anything from other departments. Sometimes the answer is no. That was my answer. And so I sought some advice from colleagues, but kind of ended up going off on my own on this. So as the GIS professional, definitely advocate to be the point of contact for these types of purchases, or an account administrator if it's a subscription, because you are the expert and you know what to do with that. For data collection, we've been very happy with the Arrow Gold, which is a RTK GPS unit. We decided to invest in something nicer from the beginning, and because we also needed an elevation measurement as well. But you may decide to start with maybe a cheaper option and then invest later on. And we also occasionally outsource. So we actually purchase aerial imagery from a vendor because we need that multiple times a year, and we don't have the capacity to bring that in-house. All right, asset management is another component to a successful GIS program, especially with stormwater. Thankfully, there are many resources out there about asset management. We decided to create our own custom application for this, since our situation, again, didn't really fit perfectly into something that was out of the box. So I created an app using Experience Builder. It links to field maps, it links to Survey 123. And for this, it was really important to consider that the main users of this application are non-GIS users, they're not GIS people. And so I really needed to make sure that the appropriate training was planned for them, and also detailed documentation. So documenting your procedures and outlining your workflow and being transparent about all of that throughout the process of development is going to save you time in the long run, even though, documenting can get annoying. But yeah, focusing on training and documentation is definitely a component of a successful program. Okay, automation. So if you have time, definitely consider options of automation from the beginning. However, I understand that's not always, we don't always have that luxury to do that from the beginning. Python and Arcade are good sources to look into. And but we actually love webhooks, so we do that. Microsoft Power Automate, formerly Microsoft Flow, is a no-code or low-code environment that allows you to chain together different triggers and actions to perform a task. So, for example, on the screen, this is a webhook that is driven from our Survey 123 app. When a survey is submitted, an email is sent out to the appropriate people, and then from there, the files are saved in certain locations. So this is an example of webhooks. If Python scares you, it's not that scary, but using something like Power Automate is a little bit less intimidating. All right. So, like I mentioned earlier, environmental justice is one of Durham County's guiding principles. GIS is a great tool for identifying environmental justice populations in your community. I like to use the NCDOT demographics tool. I used to work in transportation planning, so that's kind of what I like to use. But there are many resources out there. And using that demographic information can be used when you're developing standards, and also to focus on education and outreach efforts as well. So with me, I'm the only GIS person in my division. I'm a one-woman show, and so due to budget constraints, I can't hire an intern. So instead, we partnered with local universities, and I probably missed a few on the screen, but many local universities in North Carolina have a GIS department, and I'm sure you don't live very far from one. So with some of the grant funds I talked about earlier, we were able to partner with students from NC Central, and then NC State. For their master's program, they look for community partners, and so we became a community partner as well, where we partnered with the student for their capstone project. Okay, so I could go on and on, but just to conclude kind of what we've talked about. So unfortunately, there is not a black and white guide to starting a GIS program from scratch. And so hopefully maybe you were able to learn something if you ever find yourself in this position. So out of respect for our shareholders, we always tie everything back to our guiding principles. We stay organized by focusing on data management and data standards. We think about short-term and long-term goals at the same time and how we're going to work together to get there. We keep track of new legislation from local, state, and federal agencies. We seek funding from external sources to overcome budget limitations, and we are not afraid to look into automating our workflows. And then another thing that I like to do is set aside a little bit of time each week to learn about new trends and new things going on in GIS to try to stay on top of everything that comes out. Okay, are there any questions? Yes. Yeah. Yes, yeah. So with Survey 123 and Power Automate, for now, the way it works is it sends all attachments, so it can't like pick individual attachments, but yeah, we were able to get it to send all photos attached with the survey. Yeah. Yeah. So we do have the most advanced level license with Power Automate. So I'm not sure if that is like a bonus capability or if that or if it is included. But yeah, I could look into that and get back to you. Yeah. Thank you for your question. Okay. Yes. Yes. So we did all of our data collection internally. We used all of our inspectors who are always out in the field inspecting sites. And so we just trained them on how to use Survey 123, and they did it all. So we were very proud of them. Yes, well. Yeah, so it was, we required our engineers to submit as-built in CAD, and so we were able to use that for mapping our infrastructure, and then the rest of it was just above ground with visual inspections. Yes, good question. Yes. Um, I did it by myself. Oh, getting all the data. So we have 4 inspectors, so 4 people, and with our jurisdiction, everything is outside of city limits. So North Durham and RTP, well, not RTP, but outside of the city limits is actually pretty rural. So 4 people full time for a few months, was actually enough to get it. But we're still, it's still kind of an ongoing process. But yeah, that's how we did it. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so kind of both. So when we were discussing the level of accuracy we wanted with our stormwater assets, we decided that elevation was important. And so we used that when we were looking for GPS units and decided to make that a priority from the beginning. Yeah, thank you. Yes. Yeah, so our our stormwater manager, yes, she did find it necessary to get the invert measurement. Yeah, and um, that helped them with something that had to do with state reporting. I'm not exactly sure which component of the report they needed it, but yeah, they seem to be happy with that result. Yeah, thank you. Yes. Okay. Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So as-built are included in the engineer application when they are applying for their permit. So our permit application process is different than Survey 123. That is an external thing, and we use something called Box Drive for that. So they submit the as-built with the CAD files, and then I just bring those in to GIS and implement that into our system. But eventually that would be something that we would love to integrate with our Survey 123 system, if that's even possible. But yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah. Yeah, so in their permit applications, they submit plan sheets in PDF form, and then of course other documents that outline the project and everything that they're doing. And so yeah, did that answer your question? Okay, thank you. Thank you.